In earlier research, it had been often held that the Jesuit scholastic philosophical tradition after 1600 was essentially Suaresian. With some qualification, one can substantiate this claim. If we take into consideration only the metaphysical parts of Jesuit Cursus Philosophicae, we can observe that Disputationes Metaphysica of Suarez continued to be a paradigmatic work on metaphysics until circa 1650. That is, until the entirely new and differently organized treatises on metaphysics had been designed and published by some Jesuits. For example, the best example, Farus Scientiarum by Izquierdo or Metaphysica Demonstrativa by Honoré Fabry. At least as far as the set of questions, sequence of disputations, and most notably the general layout of metaphysical treatises authored by the Jesuits are concerned. No wonder that Pedro Hurtado de Mendoza, belonging to the next generation of Jesuit philosophers after Suarez, and being the author of the first Cursus Philosophicus produced by an individual member of a society, closely followed the composition of Dr. Eximius in his own Disputationes Metaphysicae, first edition 1615. On the other hand, it is well known that Hurtado is generally regarded as the leader and, according to the assessments of Oviedo and Izquierdo, the founder of so-called nominalist or conceptualist, as you like, current in the Jesuit scholasticism. Whereas Suarez himself is for the most part understood in recent research to be an exponent of moderate realism. It is obvious that both Suarez and Hurtado consider the epistemological and ontological dimension to be of primary importance for metaphysics. If we keep in mind that Hurtado understands some elements of epistemology differently than Suarez, one could pose the following question. Does this somewhat different epistemology have impact on the core of his metaphysical doctrine, namely on the disputation of the Conceptus Entis, its unity and abstraction? Restating the same question, whether the different, in comparison with Suarez, understanding of Præcisiones and Distinctio by Hurtado implies some changes in regard to the basic and quasi-regularly recurring after Suarez propositions of ontology, and if so, to what extent? In order to describe the problem of correspondence, or to pose the problem of correspondence and interdependence of the epistemological instruments, so to say, conception of transcendental universal concepts, as well as of distinction, first of all, of distinctions and precisions, and of ontological theory, firstly, I delineate the notions of distinctio and Præcisiones Rationis and expound the doctrine of distinctions in Suarez, in seventh Disputatio, as well as in the relevant parts of the sixth disputation by Hurtado. Then, in a kind of a short survey, I look into the Hurtado's doctrine of Conceptus Entis in Metaphysica, in second disputation, in terms of his usage of Præcisio, so to specify the unity of Conceptus Entis. In a kind of conclusion, I try to single out the points of consensus and discrepancies between the ontological doctrines of the unity of Conceptus Entis by Suarez and in presentation by Hurtado. Besides, this comparison could nicely play the role of test case to determine the true extent of the actual influence of Suarez on the post-Suarezian Jesuit metaphysics. So far was working hypothesis. Now, before we set out to explicate the conceptual distinction in Suarez, we should briefly outline the overall structure of the seventh disputation, recall the issues set up by Suarez in it, and point out a number of problems relevant for the subsequent exposition. The principal reason for introducing the disputation on distinctions into metaphysics is epistemological and rather methodical one. Since it is, say, by way of using distinctions that one obtains definitions of essences and cognizes quiddities of things, consequently, according to Suarez, it befalls to the metaphysician to investigate this difficult problem, notably to explain different modi and genera of distinctions. Historiographically, it can be noted that even though in his treatise on distinctions Soares undoubtedly drew on the corresponding question in Pedro da Fonseca's commentary on the fifth book of metaphysics, however, more generally, the structure of the whole seventh disputation seems to be governed by proceeding from the background of formalist tradition of treatises on distinctions. Indeed, two sections are very typical for treatises of this kind, namely sections on kinds of distinctions and number of distinctions, and on the way or the indices by which distinctions should be investigated and discerned from each other. The so-called formalist ars venandi distinctionis. Conferens Soares, inquirendum ergo est quod nam illi, silicet gradus et modi sint, et quibus nam indiciis seu modis discerni possint. Characteristically, by contrast with formalists and the Scottish tradition, Soares does not consider in parallel with distinctions the kinds of identities correlated with the later. He also, unlike subsequent Jesuits or, for example, Mastri, doesn't start his discussion from a detailed study of the quiddity of definition of distinction as such. In the later regard, he is tellingly non-methodical, quite not usual for him. It is only in passing that he mentions several times that distinction is always a negation, or formaliter semper in negatione consistit, expressed in the proposition like hoc non est illud. Behind this circumstance, there seems to be the problem of the general concept of distinction, which, in virtue of the first division of distinction into the real one and distinctio rationis, imperative for Soares, is inevitably equivocal, like ens rationis and ens reale. In addition, Soares' exposition in the 54th disputation, in the last, is hardly sufficient in order to solve the two more difficulties related to the concept of distinction as such, concerning firstly the status of the real negation in Soares' metaphysics. So if distinction is always a negation, the first genus of distinction comprising real distinctions, while in the last disputation negations are for the most part described as a kind of anti-rationis, although true or real negations are mentioned also. Secondly, conceptual distinctions are characterized in the same place, so in the last disputation, as a kind of relationis rationis, which in its turn raises the question of connection between conceptual relation and negation as such. Soares doesn't treat these questions at all. In spite of the formalist background inevitably present, as noted before, in any metaphysical treatise on distinctions in 16th, 17th centuries, Soares' overall motivation, on the contrary, is outwardly anti-formalist. Indeed, in his treatise, Soares proceeds from the general axiom or rule, regula generalis, non esse multiplicantes distinctiones sine sufficienti fundamento, qui distinctio non fit a natura sine sufficienti causa vel necessitate. Hence, his crucial objectives in the seventh disputations are aimed at reducing to the minimum the number of genera of distinctions, suggesting a clear and distinct nomenclature of distinctions, and subsume the kinds of distinctions known from tradition under several genera singled out for them. The very same motivation accounts for the significant place assigned by Soares to clarifying these methodical rules concerning the science of occurrence of one or another distinctions, signa discernendi, and to using them in investigation. Soares presents the overall outcome of his efforts to put in order the metaphysical inventory of distinctions as the following thesis. Praeter distinctionem realem, modalem et rationis, nullum aliam reperire, que vel not sit communis his, vel in illis non continuatur. In other words, all the other distinctions known from tradition and mentioned, for example, by Fonseca, who was the immediate source for Suarez, namely distinctio formalis, essentialis, potentialis, ex natura rei, virtualis, should reduce to these three ones. However, this thesis shows only part of what really takes place in the seventh disputation. Firstly, in the face of the old anti-Scotist argument on the inadmissibility of some third or intermediate genus of distinction falling between the real and conceptual ones, Suarez accepts it, insisting on the contradictory division of these two genera, real conceptual. So, omnis distinctio quae rationis non est realis, dic hypothesis. This is why he often calls his own model distinction a distinction ex natura rei. That is to say, real in the broadest and weakest sense. In other words, Suarez, as Duns Scotus erstwhile did, admits some latitudo distinctionum, so that both within the kind of the real distinction and within the kind of conceptual one, diverse distinctions become possible, which represent quasi-degree, greater or smaller, of the two basic distinctions. Secondly, it is clear that why Suarez specially points to the model distinction of the third one in dedicating it to it properly, the first question of the disputation. It is exactly the introduction of the model distinction and the affirmation of the new concept of modus rei, later specified as modus extrinsicus, which retrospectively proved to be his principal innovation in the doctrine of distinctions. And it is precisely this part of Suarez's doctrine of distinctions which had the greatest impact on the subsequent variations of Jesuit metaphysics. Suarez not only takes as known, I come to the conceptual, to distinctio rationis. Suarez not only takes as known and quite certain, certum, the fact that there is a real distinction in things, but also the fact that in a way there occurs distinctio rationis. As we remember, by way of describing the opposition between the two genera, Suarez initially explicates his own understanding of the conceptual distinction. Unlike the real distinction, whose extremes always occur in the thing as actually and formally distinct, or as Suarez specifies once in the sixth disputation, distinction ex natura rei, that is real, only can take place between individual and single actually existing things as such. Although by thing he means here obviously a more general concept than suppositum. Distinctio rationis in the proper sense occurs only by means of a finite intellectus grasping some things or a thing in an imperfect way, so to say abstractly, confusedly, or inadequately. In other words, this distinction is not in the thing, since it exists by itself, but neither is it a significant specification which afterwards became of importance for adherents of Hurtado's position in the object known, objectum cognitum. It consists exclusively in a certain denomination stemming from our mind's concepts. Suarez qualifies this distinction in a principled way as that which solum convenit per denominationem extrinsicum, quatenus eadem res objicitur vel subordinatur diversis conceptibus. To somewhat simplify the issue, conceptual distinction is a distinction in the very concepts of mind, or between modi concipiendi, while in things it occurs only through extrinsic denomination. Finally, we should point out some considerations important for Suarez himself in terms of his theory of conceptual distinction, as well as the certain problems simplicity present in his exposition. Firstly, for Suarez, it is crucial to dismiss the old Scottish construal of conceptual distinction as necessarily implying ens rationis as at least one or both of distinct terms, so of one or both of extremes. Suarez affirms that it is essential for conceptual distinction that it is a peculiar kind of ens rationis, produced as it were by intellectus, while the object into which it is introduced may be both ens rationis and ens reale. And besides, for the most part, it is a real being that it concerns. Quia ratio non fingit entia, quae sic distinguit, sed solum per modum distinctorum concipit quae distincta non sunt. Ergo non eque distinguntur, sed sola ipsa distinctio per rationem resultat. In this connection, a certain ambiguity arises, which is afterwards dealt with by Hurtado. On the one hand, Suarez not only describes distinctio rationis as ens rationis, although not as an ens fictum in the sense of the last disputation, but also opposes it as a being in incomplete and non-true distinction to the real distinction as a true one. On the other hand, as such, this distinction is based not on some being of reason as its object, but exclusively on its own status of denominatio extrinsica, which is by definition indifferent with regard to the division of objectivity, as subjective in intellectu, into reality or and mere thinkability, so to say. Secondly, the way Suarez clarifies the famous late Thomist division of rational distinction into two basic types, distinctio rationis ratio tenentis and ratio tenata, seems to indicate not so much the presence or absence of the so-called foundation of distinction in the thing, but rather different ways of correlation with the mind's concept. The thing which conceptually differs is always one and the same by the definition of conceptual distinction, while the concept may be either identical, adequate, and simple, and in this case, by way of iteration and certain mental comparison of this identical formal concept, there occurs distinctio rationis ratio tenentis. For example, the distinction of subject and predicate in the identical propositions. Or there are many different inadequate concepts, essentially unable to exhaust the entire essence or quiddity of an identical thing, and grasping every time its different objective aspects, so to say, by way of correlation with other things or after their likeness, and it is then that the famous distinctio rationis ratio tenata occurs. Thirdly, as regards the foundation of this distinction, it should be noted that, to my observation, Suarez does not very willingly or outside the theological context very frequently use the Thomist concept of distinctio virtualis. Probably because this concept is to some degree fictitious, as Sven Knebel once remarks, it's distinctio al sop. Suarez either simply identifies it with distinction rationis ratio tenata, which he also sometimes does with the Scottist formal distinction, or affirms that in the thing itself, instead of distinction, there is eminentia, a kind of eminentia, that is presence in one principle of all that we can understand as a multiple. So diverse operations and or effects. In this context, along with the epistemological justification of inadequacy of our concepts, standard for scholastics, Suarez sometimes also evokes the old Neoplatonist expression, "Quae sunt in inferioribus distinctas, sunt in superioribus principio unita." In other words, Suarez doesn't have one answer to the question on the foundation of this type of distinction in the thing. Finally, it is in the broad multiplicity of types of conceptual distinction with the foundation in the thing, so distinctio rationis ratio tenata, that Suarez places the distinction whose extremes are to one another as indeterminatum and determinatum. That is the way that, among others, the concepts of being as such and a certain being are to each other. Despite the fact that only 18 years separate the publication of Suarez' metaphysical work and the first edition of Disputationes by Hurtado de Mendoza, even a cursory examination of Later's theory of distinctions reveals multiple changes and shifts as compared with the seventh disputation by Suarez. They can be observed in the somewhat modified terminology, in the ratio of sizes of particular sections, in a different style of arguments, and primarily in the shift of accents and significance of various topics within the entire exposition of metaphysical knowledge. Altogether, this suggests a rather considerable change to my mind, to my observation, in the scholastic context that took place in the period between Suarez and Hurtado. I don't know exactly what are the protagonists or authors that work on this change to come being, but it is there. Excluding the first introductory metaphysical disputation, none of them equals in volume the sixth disputation on distinction, the Distinzione. In the classical Leonese edition of Universa Philosophiae in folio, it occupies over 30 pages, as compared with the only 12 dedicated to the disputation of De Ente in Communi. Therefore, together with the fifth disputation on universal unity, almost half of which is devoted to the epistemology of universal concepts, the theory of distinctions is for Hurtado the crucial point of application of his efforts in metaphysical knowledge, a kind of core of his metaphysics. It is here that most part of his extensive polemics against exponents of the idea of Præcisiones subjective focuses, which afterwards brought him the fame of the head of so-called nominalist wing. In the following, due to time limits, it will be some of thesis report. In order to understand Hurtado's approach to the theory of distinctions, it is crucial to consider the following. Distinction in general is described by Hurtado as a negation of one concept relatively to another concept, or as otherness, aletes, of one concept with regard to another. In what way does a distinction between two things, so the classical distinction between two supposita, fit into a description whose terms are concepts? Hurtado doesn't see any difficulty therein, since he affirms that distinction is real when it occurs in the thing itself, ex parte rei, between two concepts. That is, between two real concepts of two existing things. However, it doesn't follow from this that Hurtado eliminates altogether real distinction from the arsenal of metaphysics. Its discussion certainly occupies fewer pages than that of conceptual distinction, or as compared with Suarez' text, so proportionally, I mean. Yet, on the other hand, Hurtado states the division of the concept of distinction in such a way that any distinction turns to be real, quite contrary, yeah? Since conceptual distinction is also characterized as real one. But it is such a real distinction which is extrinsic for an object, unlike proper real distinction, which is intrinsic. And it belongs to the sphere of ratio as an act of prescinding or abstractive cognition. This is why Hurtado resolves the problem in Suarez's exposition noticed above by stating that conceptual distinction is not some particular ens rationis. It is instead an act of cognition which formally exists in the mind and not in the object. Hurtado explains, so to speak, the existential stages of conceptual distinction in the following way. Sorry, how much time? 5? Oh, my. Sorry. It is instead an... It only exists in intellect, and therefore it is an ens rationis, however, not in an objective sense, but in an effective or material sense. to say, as a subjective act of intellectus. As a distinction doesn't exist in the thing itself, that is to say, it doesn't constitute in the object a real negation of one relatively to the other, but constitutes he speaks of intentional negation. There are two indispensable conditions of conceptual distinctions, which are as follows. Extreme terms distinct by way of conceptual distinction are really identical, but one extreme is known without the other. That is, the one object has esse objective, esse intentionale in the intellect, while the other object, really identical with the first, doesn't possess such being. One should keep in mind that Hurtado identifies or uses as synonyms the four following terms: distinctio rationis, praecisio rationis, abstractio rationis, and less frequently separatio rationis. It's terminology issue. The fact that distinction or precision is cognition of one without the other is not disputed by anybody, but as regards understanding the way it occurs, Hurtado affirms, est gravis controversiae inter nominalis atque Thomistas. Here we are at the point where it is indispensable to say some words about the controversy on these objective formalities or precisions, which constitutes a kind of rational horizon of Hurtado's doctrine of conceptual distinction, a horizon which was still entirely absent, I think so, in Suarez metaphysics. I will only point out several moments. Firstly, both positions, it's very important, in the debate deal with the sphere of objective or intentional being. In other words, it is the objective status of concepts or predicates or formalities which is under discussion, not that of things in the physical sense. The debate concerns the principles of constitution of this sphere. Secondly, both positions converge on the inadequacy of human mind's concept being the cause of this nature of cognition. Thirdly, the positions differ, metaphorically speaking, in how deeply the acts of intellectus trace the sphere of objectivity, leaving in it some permanent or fixed traces or unities. Here is how Hurtado describes the attitude of a... okay, it's... So... finally, one word, a curious historiographical moment should be mentioned here. Hurtado draws some cartography of the scholastic institutional war with polemic, whose parties are defined in the following way. Nominalists, including Hurtado himself and some of his significant contemporaries, with their leader, true leader, Thomas Aquinas, as you once describes it. Who are misunderstood by their adversaries. Thomists, partisans of objective precisions, whose opinions are shared by many Jesuits, whose mythological progenitor is declared to be Petrus de Tarantasia, but the personality responsible for spreading and popularization of this position is, rightly understood, Duns Scotus, saved, so to speak, by Hurtado himself, from what he deemed an absurd interpretation of formal distinction as real one and not objective. Finally, somewhat on the edge of this battlefield, one can find the marginal and extremist Scotists who misunderstood their doctor and therefore posed a real distinction between metaphysical gradi and which Hurtado calls to destroy with fire and sword, even between attributes in God. To whom of the great Jesuits of the previous generation does Hurtado refer as Thomists or realists? Beyond any doubt, Molina, he says that, with certain reservations but almost permanently, Vasquez and Fonseca. The most ambiguous figure is Suarez, of whom Hurtado several times qualifies as a partisan of objective precisions, but more often he tries to demonstrate the convergence of Suarez's true position with that of nominalists, affirming that it is only for a wrong way of speaking that Suarez reproaches nominalists. Sorry. Should I put an end? So Or 3 minutes, okay. After Suarez, Hurtado denies the possibility of distinction ex natura rei between being as such and particular beings, but he justifies this by the impossibility of real distinction of universal concepts at all in general, since any ratio communis only exists through confused concepts, and being constitutes no exception. This means that the objective concept of being is distinct from any other concept, only rationi. Here, Hurtado naturally again follows Suarez. However, and here we touch on a very important moment in Hurtado's argumentation all along the disputation on being, the second one, yeah? by which exactly conceptual distinction do the objective concept of being and other more definite concepts, for example, that of substance, differ between each other? Or more accurately, how is this distinction understood? Indeed, we remember that Hurtado seemed to demonstrate in the sixth disputation the untenability of the distinction of objective formalities. Yeah? And therefore, it would be pertinent to suppose that he unfolds his argumentation based on his own conception of precision as a formal act of intellectus. However, surprising as it is, Hurtado's argumentation in his doctrine of being is marked by his more or less permanently proceeding, so to speak, secundum utramque sententiam, both according to the position denying objective precisions and according to the one admitting them. Since, in Hurtado's own construal, much like any other general concept, being cannot be objectively prescinded from other more definite concepts, according to this position, which emphasizes the immediacy and unity of the formal act of confused cognition of all instances of being, his own position, yeah? It is quite easy to prove the unity of some objective concept of being corresponding to this act, since the unity of formal concept is proved, that of objective concept follows directly from that. Strictly speaking, Hurtado's explanations make it doubtful sometimes, it seems like, that these two unities differ at all. Demonstration of the unity of objective concept of being proceeding from the position of objective formalities look much more complex. Here Hurtado has to introduce special distinctions between adequate and inadequate distinctions, mutual and non-mutual inclusion of one formality in another, and so on. Along this greater simplicity, Hurtado's own concept of conceptual precision has to his mind the advantage of uniformity of argumentation. The type of unity of objective concept of being does not differ from the unity of the objective concept of animal or from any concept. Hurtado usually calls both of them logical unity. That is general unity of concept originating in a confused act of cognition, not expressing difference. In conclusion, I would like to underline the following moment. The fact that Hurtado develops a specifically new variety of epistemology, substantially different from Suarez's. For example, despite Hurtado's attempts to qualify Suarez as an exponent of directly but confusedly grasping in a concept all the multiple singular things and their similarity to each other with respect to being. The second disputatio of Suarez contains several places indicative of the significantly more fixed and self-contained nature of unity of objective concept of being in Suarez than in Hurtado. Is not conducive to this shift, this development is not conducive to any radical change in structure of the doctrine of being. Moreover, the astonishing fact that Hurtado freely introduced into his doctrine of being two seemingly contradictory lines of argumentation, namely those respectively admitting and denying objective formalities, means that Hurtado didn't think metaphysics was a proper place for any innovations. On the other hand, if one considers the disputation on being within the whole context of Hurtado's metaphysics, compares it with Suarez on the one hand, and metaphysics subsequent cursus philosophicae written by the Jesuits, for example, Arriaga, Oviedo, and Lynch, One could note that after Hurtado, and in part apparently due to the impact of the new epistemology, some tendencies incipient in his metaphysics strengthened. In particular, the doctrine of the concept of being, which was uncontestably the core and heart of metaphysical doctrine in Suarez, either is reduced altogether or is transferred into one of logical disputations, while being replaced by the discussion of essence, possibility, and existence, or else by extensive discussion of substance, or by a completely new theory of stages of things, status rerum. Yeah, Jakob Schmutz has written about it. However, the presence of the theory of distinctions, for example, remains permanent. Moreover, with time, the significance of this theory only grows. Thank you. Excuse me for the time.